everyone, it's Katrina. Number 10. Ksar Draw. Among the shifting sands of the Algerian desert, there is an ancient ruin by the name of Ksar Draw. It is by far one of the most mysterious desert ruins in the world. It's in the middle of absolute nowhere, with miles in every direction being a literal sea of sand. It doesn't look like it should even be there, and nobody knows who built it or how long it's existed. There's almost no information about Ksar Draw online, very few photographs of it, and no archaeologists discussing it. The only information you can find about this place pops up on travel websites with their pages thick in Arabic and French. So if you guys want to translate, that would be helpful. In any case, if you want to visit somewhere off the beaten path, this might be it. The desert ruin is closest to the modern town of Timimoun, Adrar province. The structure has just one circular double wall standing several feet high, a handful of rooms, no windows, no staircases, and looks like the bottom of a destroyed cylindrical tower. Locals don't know anything about the structure anymore. It's been guessed that a mysterious sect of desert Jews lived here, but no one knows when. It could be the remains of a military barracks or a remote prison. But who would build such a forsaken prison in the middle of an inhospitable desert? Who could possibly be so dangerous as to be kept here? Asking these questions isn't going to go as far because nobody knows the answers. The most realistic answer is that Ksar Draw was a caravanserai. These were small circular enclosures built throughout the desert to facilitate camel caravans. But normally these places would be built within a day's ride of one another so that a caravan didn't get stuck in the desert. In this case, there is only a single ruin in a vast wasteland. Do you have any theories about why this place was built? Let me know in the comments. Number 9. The Lost Cities of Libya. Archaeologists discovered evidence of a lost civilization in the Libyan section of the Sahara Desert. The bones of this forgotten culture were found thanks to satellite images. Using satellites and aerial photography, a team of researchers from the University of Leicester identified over 100 lost structures in the desert. These structures include fortified farm villages, settlements, larger towns, and what might even be castles. This is one of the most inhospitable deserts in the world, yet evidence shows that it was once a thriving region. Scientists aren't sure if the people here lived amidst the sand or if the Sahara truly looked that much different 2,000 years ago. Researchers believe most of the identified remains were built between 1 and 500 AD. These settlements and castles were not recorded by the Libyan government, and most haven't been explored by any modern archaeologist. They were built by a lost civilization known as the Garamantes. They have been gone for so long that they've begun to fade from history. Most of what we know about the Garamantes comes from Roman historians. The Romans described them as troublemakers living at the edge of their empire. They were supposedly barbaric nomads who slaughtered the innocent, practiced cannibalism, and were disorganized. But it looks like the Romans were lying. It was likely a form of propaganda pushed by the Roman elite to make their desert neighbors to the south seem like savages. We can see by the ruins spread throughout the desert that the Garamantes were highly civilized. They lived in huge settlements and turned the bleak desert into a paradise pocketed with rich oases. They also developed their own language and technology, so not really barbaric. But if the Garamantes were so civilized, what happened to them? Why did they abandon their settlements in the desert and leave the whole region to ruin? That is a mystery we have yet to solve. We know they seemed to be perfectly fine during the Roman Empire, likely because the Romans weren't about to march through the blazing hot desert to destroy them. Still, all traces of them were gone by the 7th century AD. All that remains now are their abandoned castles and towns. And now for number 8. But first, I want to give a big shout out to YT Teach and Travis Johnson. Thanks so much for watching and spending time with us. If you are new here, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join the family. Number 8. Hatra. Most people are not familiar with the Kingdom of Hatra. It's not exactly a household name. But this small kingdom was extremely important in the 2nd century BC. They were one of the first Arab states that established themselves outside of Arabia, which was a pretty big deal. They became a caravan city in the desert, acting as a buffer state between the Roman Empire and their enemies, the Parthians. The capital was the city of Hatra, located in northern Iraq. Most historians agree the city was founded between 312 and 63 BC during the Seleucid period, but perhaps closer to the 2nd century. It soon became a major trading center thanks to the caravans that were traveling across the desert on their way to Upper Mesopotamia. All the cash from the caravans helped transform the city, and their wealth bought them power. When they reached their peak around the time Christ was born, circa 30 AD, the city was monumental. There were gigantic temples dedicated to what would soon be pagan gods. The best known include Nergal, who was mentioned in the Bible, and other gods like Hermes, Atargatis, Shamash, and Baal, all of whom were later abolished by the rising Christianity. But the city was also multicultural, with citizens from Greece, Mesopotamia, Canaan, and Arabia. For such a singular entity, the Kingdom of Hatra did surprisingly well. There were Roman invasions, but the city was defended by huge defensive walls and 160 guard towers. Emperor Trajan and Emperor Septimius Severus each laid siege to the city. Both failed epically and had to go back to Rome with their tails between their legs. Unfortunately for Hatra, beating the Romans was worse than if they'd been conquered. The Romans initiated wall tactics. They created border defenses along their territory, halting the caravans that used to run through Hatra. In a very short time, Hatra ran out of supplies and their wealth dwindled. The kingdom fell into pieces and was completely obliterated by 240 AD. All that remains of their power are a handful of broken walls and stone gateways deep in the Iraqi desert. Number 7. The Terran Basin mummies. It was decades ago that scientists started to come across naturally mummified bodies in a barren desert in northwest China. What started as a handful of mysterious corpses is now one of the greatest archaeological enigmas of the Far East. We call them the Terran Basin mummies. The first mummies were found in the early part of the 20th century, but the majority of excavations weren't finished until the 1990s. The human remains were found in multiple cemeteries spread throughout the Uyghur Autonomous Region in Xinjiang. They were buried from between 2000 BC and 280 AD, at which point the Terran Basin culture swiftly vanished. Because of the extraordinarily dry conditions of the desert, the mummies preserved themselves naturally. Their hair, their clothing, their burial goods, their skin, everything is still in pristine condition. All of this wouldn't be nearly so strange if it weren't for how distinct their culture was from every other one in the area. The burial practices of the Terran Basin were weird, to say the least. Even though they lived in a vast desert with no ocean in sight, they buried their loved ones in boat-shaped structures. Then they covered these boat-shaped coffins in cowhide, left giant oars as grave markers, and that was it. Do you know who else buried their dead in boats? The Vikings. But the Vikings lived on the other side of the world, so it makes no sense. The Terran Basin culture left behind small graveyards all over the desert. These were gradually covered by the shifting sand, and while researchers have found a whole ton of these graveyards, chances are there are way more that haven't been found. The experts don't know what's going on here. Anthropologist Michael Fracchetti from Washington University called the boat burials one of the biggest enigmas of a desert population. Michael said the Terran Basin culture should have been the last in the world to perform such burials. It doesn't make any sense. Excavations have even revealed ancient nets that you would expect to be used for fishing in rivers. But there are no rivers here. It's a desert. The only thing that makes any real sense is that there was water here 4,000 years ago. Maybe there were rivers, perhaps even a huge lake. And when that water dried up, the Terran Basin culture buried their loved ones in boats as a tribute to those lost waterways. What do you think? Boats in the desert? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Number 6. A lost palace. A team of archaeologists working closely with the British Museum have finally discovered the ancient city of Girzu on the dry southern plains of Iraq. The ruins date back 5,000 years, possibly even 5,500 years. The palace belonged to the lost civilization of the Sumerians, the first truly advanced society in the world. The Sumerians were the ones who came up with the first complicated law system. They have been credited with making the first written language, and they made huge accomplishments in art, science, architecture, and community organization. They were the original template for the civilizations that came later in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Arabia, and Greece. We don't know for certain if they were technically the first civilization, but they were definitely the first big one we know about. Girzu was a legendary city, believed to have been one of the first in the world. This is the cradle of civilization, and it was buried under dirt and sand for centuries. Researchers with the British Museum began excavating in 2015, and finally they've uncovered the Grand Palace. We already knew the city was here because it was found in 1877 by French explorer Ernest de Sarzec, but political issues and constant warfare kept archaeologists from going back until recently. The palace in Girzu was immense, bigger than most government houses, and made entirely of mud brick walls. This was the place where the kings of civilization sat on their gilded throne. It's totally in ruins now, but archaeologists have been able to make some stunning reconstructions. The palace was also equipped with religious temples. There was a sanctuary to the Mesopotamian god of war Ningirsu. In 1739 BC, the Sumerian civilization collapsed. They were invaded by the Elamites, who knocked down their Great Wall and sent them into oblivion. Girzu was lost forever in the desert. Number 5. The Girash Ruins. Girash is an ancient Roman city in Jordan that was founded by none other than Alexander the Great in the 4th century BC. This was a lavish city with a population close to 20,000. It was later conquered by General Pompey in 63 BC, integrated into Rome, and then it grew to become one of the greatest Roman cities in the Middle East. It was part of the Decapolis, a group of 10 semi-autonomous cities that made up the Roman province of Syria. But as with most desert metropolises, Girash ran into serious trouble. It was invaded by the Persians, then by the Muslims during the Islamic conquest of the 7th century. And finally, a series of earthquakes caused so much damage that the city was abandoned. With nobody to take care of it, Girash was covered over by the desert sand. It remained buried until 1806, when German explorer Ulrich Jasper Seesten found it. The whole place had to be dug out of the sand and has been excavated routinely since 1925. Being buried in sand is likely why this city is in such good shape today. The sand kept it from totally falling apart. The Roman and Byzantine ruins are some of the best preserved in the world. Even though the city was built in the desert, its altitude at 1,600 feet meant that it was relatively temperate weather. The rolling hills were fertile, allowing humans to live here for thousands of years. Long before Girash, groups of people lived in the hills outside modern Amman for an estimated 4,500 years. They had access to olive trees, wheat, pasture for livestock, and iron ore mining. What else could you ask for? Number 4. Symbols in the desert. In the northeastern corner of Qatar, along the coast, scattered throughout the wind-swept desert, there are strange symbols carved into the rock. These symbols and mysterious depressions almost look like an ancient board game scrawled into the stone. The origins of these drawings are not entirely known. One of the biggest and most important of the rock sites is Al-Jassasiyya. A mysterious group of people centuries ago used limestone outcrops as their personal canvas to create art. They drew symbols, motifs, animals, and anything else they witnessed in their environment. In total, there are an estimated 900 rock carvings at Al-Jassasiyya. Farhan Sakal, the site manager at Qatar Museums, says the carvings represent a high degree of creativity. He cited petroglyphs of ships seen from a bird's-eye view. This would have taken serious observational creativity and abstract thinking, something we don't see in a lot of petroglyphs. Most rock art is based on reality, with the artists copying what they see with their own eyes directly in front of them. But here, the image of a ship, as seen from the sky, is something remarkable. The site was discovered in 1957 and has since been excavated and photographed by scientists all over the world. Even with all the research, we don't know how old the petroglyphs are. They likely weren't made at the same time, but periodically over the centuries. We also don't know which civilization was responsible for the carvings. They are all over the desert here, and no one knows the creative genius behind them. Who do you think carved these unique petroglyphs? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe while you're at it. Number 3. Atlantis of the Sands. Atlantis of the Sands is part myth, part reality. According to legend, there was once a grand and splendid city in the Arabian desert. To be specific, it was in the empty quarter, a place where there is basically nothing except sand, rock, and the occasional ruin from a lost civilization. The city was named Iram of the Pillars, controlled by a tribe known only as the Ad. You can find this story in the Quran. The Holy Book says the residents of Iram of the Pillars abandoned the teachings of the Prophet Hud. Then they turned from God. In response, God struck back with furious anger. God unleashed a scourge that buried the city and everyone in it under a mountain of sand. The powerful and fabulously wealthy city was gone in seconds, as if it were on the bottom of an hourglass that got flipped the wrong way. The story is indeed in the Quran, but there is another version in 1001 Arabian Nights. The latter is at least 1,000 years old. Because of its prevalence in Arabian culture, many believe the stories of Iram of the Pillars to be at least somewhat rooted in reality. It's very possible there was a civilization in the empty quarter that got buried during a sandstorm. It could have been a natural disaster that was interpreted as an act of God. The biggest issue is that we don't have any proof that such a city existed. In the 20th century, there was a real desire to find the city. Lawrence of Arabia went in search of it, but died in 1935 before he could find it. British explorer Bertram Thomas became the first Westerner to cross the empty quarter in the early 20th century, driven onward by his vision of a sparkling city in the rolling waves of the desert. But he never found it either. And even today, with all the technology we have, there is still no evidence Iram of the Pillars existed. But if it really was buried under the sand, it's not like you'd be able to see it, even if you were standing right on top of it. Number 2. The Nia Ruins. The Nia Ruins are at the southern edge of the Terran Basin. It's the same desert where the Terran Basin culture left their mummified bodies in makeshift boats. But the Nia Kingdom was an entirely different set of people, one who lived far more recently. Their ancient capital Nia was a major commercial center on one of the branches of the Silk Road. There was a large oasis at the edge of the city, which was likely all that allowed them to survive in the brutal desert. During ancient times, camel caravans arrived in Nia with goods from China on their way to Central Asia to places like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. This was arguably the hardest stretch of the Silk Road, since it ran straight through the desert all the way to the rolling Kazakh steppes and to the sweltering hot lands of Uzbekistan and Afghanistan. But we can't talk about the Nia Kingdom without mentioning their neighbors, the Lulan Kingdom. Because after hundreds of years of independent success, Nia was absorbed by the Lulan Kingdom in the 3rd century AD. The Lulan Kingdom prospered in the Taklamakan Desert with great success up until 1400 years ago. That was when the desert started moving, and their cities were literally swallowed by waves of shifting sand. They had the Nia Kingdom to the west and Dunhuang to the east. All three were major trading hubs, but Lulan was the most powerful and absorbed Nia. They lasted an exceptional 500 years more, longer than the Roman Empire, and then vanished without a trace in the 5th century. All of a sudden, they disappeared from all recorded history and were never heard from again. The ruins of Nia are still out there in the desert, slowly but surely being erased by the winds of time. The ruins of the Lulan Kingdom are there too, also being eaten by the Taklamakan Desert. Nobody even knew they were there until Swedish adventurer Sven Hedin stumbled upon them by accident in the 20th century. It took decades, but we finally have most of the history of these desert kingdoms in proper order. Number 1. Chingeti under the sands. New scientific evidence has proved beyond any doubt that the Sahara Desert is expanding at about 30 miles per year to the south. In the last few decades, the newest part of the Sahara is a massive chunk of land in Mauritania. The newly conquered land is about 260 acres in size and is home to the ancient village of Chingeti. The village isn't lost, although it is a sad shell of its former self. Chingeti was once a vibrant trading center and a place of great religious knowledge, but it's currently in the process of being utterly obliterated by the unstoppable desert. The ancient paths are full of sand, piled up like snowbanks against abandoned homes, and it's only one bad storm away from being uninhabitable. It's an unfortunate state of affairs because Chingeti is home to historical mosques that attracted Sunni pilgrims across Africa starting in the 13th century. For almost 500 years, this was a gathering place for pilgrims on their way to Mecca. It was a place where they could stop to pray, trade exotic goods, and share news of the world. There were 20,000 people here at one point, and the locals grew rich from catering to the thousands of caravans that passed through, with over 30,000 camels gathered here at once. Though unfortunate, it's also interesting because we are witnessing firsthand what's already happened in so many desert cities. All these places I've told you about that were erased by the desert, this is how it happens. Chingeti is a real-time example of every ruin half buried in the Sahara or one of the other deserts of the world. It's only a matter of time before Chingeti joins them in the eternal graveyard of the Sahara. Thanks for watching! Would you rather live in the scorching hot city in the Sahara or deep in the wet jungles of the ancient Maya kingdom? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Be sure to subscribe if you haven't already and come back soon. Bye!